Hi everyone, and welcome to your lesson on quantitative and qualitative data. So these are your 3 learning intentions today. So by the end of the lesson you'll be able to identify and describe the differences between quantitative and qualitative information. By the end of the lesson you'll be able to identify which methods you've used already to gather such 2 different types of information. And finally, by the end of the lesson you'll be able to explain the benefits and limitations of each. This will also help you to analyse or evaluate data gathering methods. And so let's just take a look at a short introduction to quantitative and qualitative data.
Upload a new math video every day. In this video I'd like to talk about data. Data can be divided into 2 groups called quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data is numerical. Qualitative data is descriptive data. Let's look at some examples of both. Some examples of quantitative data would be the number of pets, the time of day, the temperature outside. Quantitative data can be graphed. If you count or measure, you are collecting quantitative data. There are 2 types of quantitative data, discrete and continuous. Discrete data is usually data you can count, and continuous data is usually data that you measure. I have a separate video on these 2 types of data. Qualitative data is descriptive or observation and uses words. For example, the color of a house, the smell of a sock, the texture of a shirt. Let's look at quantitative or qualitative. Consider a cat. The quantitative data would be that the cat has 4 legs and weighs 10 pounds. The qualitative data would be the cat is yellow and has soft fur. Let's look at a bookshelf. The quantitative data would be you have 50 books on the bookshelf and is 50 centimeters tall. The qualitative data would be that it is multicolor and has a smooth surface. Hope this video helps on quantitative and qualitative
monitoring methods. So let's go over the 2 different types of data and a little bit more description. So quantitative data, this is data that is usually concerned with factual information, but this is dependent on the data gathering method you use and whether it's reliable or not. It isn't based on opinion or judgment. It usually results in numerical results. To remember it, try and think quantity, that gets numbers. For qualitative data, this type of data concerns thoughts and opinions. It looks at how good you think you are in a certain factor. Qualitative methods are often used for the mental, emotional and social factors because you can give opinions on how you feel about yourself and others. Some of these factors, such as happiness, anxiety and confidence, can only be answered by the performer as only they know how they truly feel. Qualitative data usually results in text results. So what type of data gathering methods gather each type of data? Well, for quantitative data, we usually see standardized tests being used, such as the bleep test, or like in this video here, we can see the 50-meter sprint test. As you can see, it gathers numerical data. Now for qualitative data, here you can clearly see that the answers and the data that's provided are in text. However, just be careful. it isn't quite as clear-cut as that. Some data gathering methods, which are based on thoughts and opinions, can provide numerical results, which might be a little confusing. So for example, the Sports Competition Anxiety Test, or better known as the SCAT test, which you might have used in National 5, is a questionnaire that gathers information on how well you control your anxiety levels during performance. It contains 15 statements to which a response choice is rarely, sometimes and often. Each answer is given a score which you then add up at the end and compare to the norm. So, despite receiving a figure or a number at the end of the SCAT test, it still remains a qualitative method because the score comes from your opinion about how well you control your anxiety in certain situations. So try not to get that confused. Even if you get a number at the end, it's based on opinion, so it remains a qualitative method. So let's put this knowledge into practice here. Where do the data gathering methods that you've used for higher PE so far fall? Are they quantitative data gathering methods or are they qualitative data gathering methods? Take 5 minutes, pause this slide or pause the video here and try and fill these in. So here are some examples which you can check and change to see if you're correct or not. So on the quantitative side, you've got lots of standardised tests here. You've got the 50-metre sprint test, which is for physical factors. You've got the Illinois agility test, which is again a physical factor. You've got blackout testing, which is for a mental factor. And you've got movement or match analysis, which is observation schedules combined with a video. And that again, a physical factor. And for the qualitative data gathering methods, you've got the trait sport confidence inventory, which is for an emotional factor. You've got the youth sport questionnaire, which is for the social factor of team dynamics. You've got the profile of mood states questionnaire, which is emotional. All of these three things give you a number in the end, but they're based on qualitative information. And you've got the concentration and focus skills test, which is for a mental factor. So like we mentioned earlier, often the qualitative data that you're getting are for emotional, social and sometimes mental factors. However, depending on the tool like blackout testing, you can get quantitative data for that as well. So check and change your answers. So let's try this for the monitoring methods that you use for higher PE. Your monitoring methods also gather data. So is this quantitative or is it qualitative? Take 5 minutes to pause this slide or pause the video, and you can try and fill in the ones that you've used for your developing your factors so far. Again, it's time to check and change your work here. For quantitative monitoring methods, you've got repeating midway tests. So again, you could repeat your Illinois agility test, your blackout testing, your 50-metre sprint test, or your movement or match analysis, and that would give you quantitative data during your monitoring process. For qualitative data, it could be your training diary, or it could be repeating your qualitative methods, which would be all the things listed below. So check and change your work. If you've got it right, great. If you haven't, just change it. That's learning. So let's move on to our other learning intention, which is to be able to explain the benefits and limitations of each type of data. On the left of this table here, you've got the benefits. So the data isn't affected by bias. It provides a depth. It provides specificity to the performer. It's easier to monitor. It can analyse large groups very quickly. So pause the slide here and write on the right hand column in the rows, which type of data do you think reflects the benefits? Take 5 minutes. Again, it's check and change time. Here's the answers. Check and see if you've got everything right. So it's not affected by bias. That's quantitative information because that's usually factual and isn't based on opinion or subjective thoughts. Providing a depth to the data, that's qualitative data. That's because when you're asking for someone's thoughts and opinions, you tend to get far more detail than one simple timing in the 50-metre sprint test. You don't know why they got that score that day. There's a lack of detail in that. So that's qualitative data. It provides specificity to the performer. Again, that's qualitative data, because in these opinions and thoughts you're getting far more detail than the simple just the number. It's easier to monitor. That's quantitative data. It's far easier to compare numbers than it is lots and lots of words on a page. It's far quicker because you can see that your score has gone from 9.8 to 7.2. Can analyse large groups very quickly. Again, that's quantitative data. There isn't screeds of information that you've got to scroll through. It's just a list of numbers on a page. You can clearly see wherever they fit. So this leads on very easily to the limitations of each type of data, and having done the last task there, this should be much easier. So pause the slides here and write down in the right hand column whether you think these limitations are quantitative or qualitative. It's again not easy to analyse large groups very quickly. It might not provide specificity to the performer. It has limited depth to the data. It's not as easy to monitor, and it can be affected by bias. So pause the slide, write down in the right hand column what you think. So again, it's time to check and change your work and see if you got your answers right. Not easy to analyse large groups very quickly. That's qualitative data, because again, those written answers, they can be long and can take a long time to get through and understand, unlike looking at a list of 30 performers who have completed the bleep test or the 50-metre sprint test. Second line down, you've got it might not provide specificity to the performer. That's quantitative data. Again, there's not a lot of depth in information. When you get that result of 9.2 for the 50-metre sprint test, you don't know why or what's happened that day to cause that score. If it was a qualitative questionnaire afterwards, you would get far more data, but it's not. So the next one is it has limited depth to the data. Again, it's quantitative data for the same reasons I've just mentioned before. It's not as easy to monitor. That's qualitative data. Again, if you're repeating a questionnaire maybe 3 weeks into a 6-week training program for a mental, emotional or social factor, it's often can take a long time to read through the comments that you've made from one questionnaire to another and compare your progress at that point. It can be affected by bias. That's qualitative data. If you're completing a questionnaire and you're sitting next to a partner doing so or a training partner doing that, you might not feel comfortable to write down exactly what you're thinking or what your thoughts are. So this data can be affected by the bias or opinions that you've got. So continuing to look at how we explain the benefits and limitations of one type of data. In the last couple of slides we've just identified, we've made a point about what's good or bad about this data, but obviously we know in hierarchy that we need to use a P chain. This would be the need to use a point, example and explanation to get the one full mark. So point, example and explain for each 1 mark of your answer. So as you can see in this table, on the left hand side under the point, we've used all of the reasoning behind the last few slides. So we've got easy to monitor, it's not affected by bias, can analyse large groups very quickly, it might not provide specificity, and it has limited depth to data. That's quantitative data. These are the benefits and limitations of quantitative data. But to get those full marks, we've had to write an example of what that means and then an explanation of its impact. So I'll just talk through one, because otherwise I'd be talking for a long time and you can all read. So if it's easier to monitor, an example of how it's easier to monitor is, for example, you get a numerical result which you could easily compare to the midway number if you've repeated the test. Explanation. Meaning it's practical and you can quickly identify if progress has been made or not and plan the next stage of the PDP. So take your time to read through all of the answers that are on here and get a sound understanding of what it takes to get a mark for each one of the points here. Once you've done that, pause the video here or pause the PowerPoint that you're using and copy this table down with the exact same number of columns and rows and the same headings. Then what I want you to do is I'd like you to explain the benefits and limitations of qualitative data using the information that's on here. All you'll really need to do is kind of flip your answers there. So if it was easy to monitor, which is quantitative data, for qualitative data, you're probably going to have to say that it isn't that easy to monitor. So see if you can then attempt the example and the explanation for each. For good practice, try and use the words such as practical, reliable and invalid at this point, or valid and impractical or unreliable. So see how you get on with that. So for one last time, it's time to check and change your answers. That might have been quite challenging for you there. So what I've asked you to do was to explain the benefits and limitations of the other type of data, which was qualitative data. Use the answers on the screen now to check your work. If you've got something that you need to correct, do it. Again, that's the learning process. A key thing to bear in mind here is when you're explaining the benefits and the limitations of qualitative and quantitative data is that the explanation should always relate to the PDP and how it's helped you to plan it or monitor it, because ultimately that's why we're gathering data, to see if our PDP, our performance development process, is going well or to plan it. So it's time to check your learning. Let's see if we've met the 3 learning intentions. So to do so, I would like you to tell me the questions to these answers. So, for question number 1, what is question number 1? Look at the answers here, or the answer here, and write down what the question would be in the exam. Pause the video here for a couple of minutes. Question number 2, what would it be? Have a look and read through the answer here and try and figure it out. Write it down, pause the video for a couple of minutes. And for question number 3, this would be the answer to the 50-metre sprint test and a questionnaire. What would the question to this small answer be? Take a second to write it down before you move on. So, here are the answers. Take a look and see if you've got them correct. If you haven't, perhaps go back through the video and have a think of why you might have got that wrong there, or you might have got a tiny bit in the wrong place there. So number 1 would be explain the benefits and limitations of quantitative data. You should have picked that up because you should have seen the PEE chains at the side. Now remember, you can do that in the exam and we would encourage you to do that. It makes it really clear for the marker to see that you understand what an explain answer is, and it makes sure that you are using the same process to do that. So number 2 was describe qualitative and quantitative data. That should have been fairly easy for you to see. There was no structure to the answer, it was paragraphs, that's what we want to see. There was no becauses, there was no meanings, it just painted a picture of what they were. And number 3 was identify a quantitative and qualitative data gathering method. Just really simple, and they were just 1 or 2 word answers, just quickly identifying, and that's all you need to do for Hire for identify, just quickly identify a couple of words. Anyway, that's your lesson for today. Hope it's been helpful. Any feedback would be gratefully appreciated.